So maybe the difference is if you work hard, if there's pain and then you get dopamine, that's what you want. So if you work a hard day and then you've got the finance to have a nice meal, that's going to be far better because you actually have to put the effort in. But if you're a multimillionaire and the food gets delivered and it's so easy and you're eating, or you just get onto social media and you just press a button, or you get onto Netflix, there's no work involved. There's no sacrifice to build up to that. It's just instantaneous, like a drug or cocaine or psychedelic. It's straight away, it hits you without that pain process in place.
Right, exactly. So again, what is an intoxicant? An intoxicant is something that releases a lot of dopamine all at once in the reward pathway, more than our brains were evolved to tolerate. If you think about the environment that our brains evolved in, they evolved in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, where we would have to walk tens of kilometers every day for a tiny little bit of water, tiny little bit of food, maybe the occasional new human being, right? Now we're living in this world of overwhelming overabundance. But bottom line, an intoxicant releases a lot of dopamine all at once. Our brain is reeling to try to compensate, does that by downregulating dopamine transmission, involuting postsynaptic dopamine receptors, not just a baseline, below baseline. And then with repeated exposure, that thing that was initially salient is no longer salient. But that after effect, the dopamine deficit state is stronger and longer, and we kind of get stuck in that state. And now we're depressed, we're anxious, we're irritable, we can't sleep, and we're craving, right? We have a narrowing of our focus. We're constantly thinking about using our drug of choice. I do want to, though, highlight, you said one thing that I think we need to think about and be cautious about, which is what I call the work hard, play hard mentality, which is also very common today, especially among successful professionals, where, yes, they're doing hard things all day long, but they're not doing things that give them that natural dopamine reward. It's a different kind of stress that then actually increases craving for intoxicants. So they get to the end of the day and then they go home and they drink or they smoke or, they use or they binge on Netflix or pornography, video games. That is very bad for our brains because now we're tweaking it on the pain side and tweaking it on the pleasure side and getting into this serious seesaw effect, which is essentially, an enormous literal physiologic stressor because every time our brain has to work to try to restore homeostasis or baseline levels of dopamine firing, we release adrenaline, right? We have a cortisol, a stress response. So now you've got this work hard, play hard thing where the whole day is arranged around sort of intense sacrifice, then followed by intense reward, very confusing for our brains.
So the sacrifice is too much and then the reward is too much. So the level's swinging too high. It's not incremental changes. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. One of the ways to think about this is a metaphor that I use, which is like a seesaw or a teeter-totter, which represents how we process pleasure and pain. One of the important findings in neuroscience is that pleasure and pain are actually co-located in the brain and work like opposite sides of a balance. When we do something pleasurable, the balance tips one way, pain, it tips the other. But there are rules governing this balance. The first and most important is that it wants to remain level, or what we call homeostasis. This is baseline levels of dopamine firing. We're always releasing dopamine at a kind of baseline tonic level. How does our brain return to homeostasis? First, by tilting an equal and opposite amount to whatever the stimulus was. So we use an intoxicant that releases dopamine. The balance tilts to the side of pleasure. The brain then adapts by downregulating dopamine transmission. Like you can think of that as these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as it's level. They stay on until it's tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's craving, wanting. If we use, again, to try to restore the level balance, what happens over time with repeated exposure is that initial release of dopamine gets weaker and shorter in duration. So that tip to the side of pleasure gets weaker and shorter, but the after response to the pain side gets stronger and longer. In other words, those gremlins multiply. They turn into Arnold Schwarzenegger gremlins. And if we then continue to expose our brain to intoxicants over longer periods of time, we eventually end up with enough gremlins to fill this whole room. They're camped out on the pain side of the balance. Now we've entered addicted brain. We've changed our hedonic or joy set point. Now we need to use in more potent forms and in larger amounts, not to get high and feel good, but just to counteract those gremlins and level the balance. And when we're not using, importantly, we are experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance: anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and craving. So when I make a therapeutic intervention now for anxiety, insomnia, depression, or cravings, not everybody comes in looking for help with those behaviors. They're coming in for depression or anxiety. One of the first things that I will do is I recommend a period of abstinence of about 4 weeks from their drug of choice to give enough time for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance and for homeostasis to be restored. And in about 80% of all comers, when we do that, people initially feel worse before they feel better, right? Because you're taking the reward off the pleasure side, you're slamming it down to the pain side. But eventually the gremlins get the message, they hop off the balance. And by weeks 3 and 4 of that dopamine fast, patients feel a whole lot better. Not just better than they did in the first 2 weeks, better than they have in a really long time. The other thing we recommend to them is that they intentionally press on the pain side of the balance by doing things that are hard: exercise, ice cold water bath, sauna, some cases just walking in the neighborhood because people are very sedentary. And by intentionally pressing on the pain side, we get those gremlins to change their allegiance, go to the pleasure side, and we get our dopamine indirectly by paying for it up front. But again, we're not talking about extreme forms of pain like self-cutting or excessive stressful working and sleep deprivation, not things like that. It's mild stressors, exercise, intermittent fasting to a degree, ice cold water immersion, things like that.